Before the competition, let's get inspired by the keynote lecture on the topic of an alternative improved ASEAN by His Excellency Kasit Pirom. Let me take this opportunity to introduce the speaker. His Excellency Kasit Pirom was born on the 15th of December 1944 at Thonburi. He received Bachelor of Science (BSc) from School of Foreign Service, class of 68, Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. And he got diploma in International Relations and master degree of Social Science from the Institute of Social Studies, The Hague, the Netherlands. In the past, he was a member of Democrat Party, civil servant career diplomat of MFA, which is ambassador to USSR or Russia, Indonesia, Germany, Japan, and the USA. Also, he was a foreign minister and member of the National Reform Steering Assembly. At present, he is a member and an advisor of a number of organizations such as Nuclear Society of Thailand and Rangsit University. Furthermore, he is the senior fellow of the Institute of Security and International Studies, or ISIS. He is the chair of Foundation for Sustainability and founding member of SEAC Group. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the keynote lecture by His Excellency Kasit Pirom.
สวัสดีครับ Selamat pagi to everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And second, for the honor to allow me to say a few things about ASEAN and its future prospect. But I also would like to, congratulate all the three universities in advance for a very successful, organization on this for the speech competition and so on. And I would also like to wish you good health and be safe from now on, and do enjoy, the academic pursuit as well as be a sort of the conscience and advisors to the advancement of the ASEAN community in general. I would like to invite all of you to join me in, reviewing the evolution or the progression of ASEAN of the past 57 years, so that we could, remind ourselves of what did happen, what has been happening, and what would be the future prospect for the new alternative ASEAN, or for the transformation of the current ASEAN to make it more relevant to the present geopolitical situation and the demands of the planet Earth post COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, the United Kingdom. Let me divide the progression or development of ASEAN into three phases for us to really understand the historical side and the current challenges and the future, challenges of ASEAN. I would like to say that the first phase of ASEAN would be from 1967 to 1991. That's about covering more or less the whole period of the Cold War era. And in that sense, the original members of ASEAN of the five, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, and a few years later, Brunei joined in, were, staunchly anti-communism. So, and at the same time, did opt for the capitalist market economy that is dealing with the, the global trade in an open manner with the private sector-led economy, so to say. And during this Cold War period, till the end of it, it could be said that we all had been very successful together in, opposing the expansion of communism we were able to together deny the domino theory of communist expansion. And in that period, we were also able to repulse the occupation of Vietnamese forces in Cambodia. And we were able to work together to bring about peace in Cambodia under the UN interim administration. Okay, so that was the first period. And in siding with the Western world or with the free world and so on, ASEAN of the six was able to complete the drastic socio-economic development. And we were, I think, at one time perceived to be the next group of tigers of the newly emerging economies and so on. But even we were not being able to become together developed countries. But I think we have achieved a lot indeed. And maybe Singapore is the only one that have joined the rank of, I think, developed country. But I think we can continue to pursue further so that all of us will eventually become developed economies and second to none in that sense. And I think during this Cold War period, since we were all anti-communist and we opted for the capitalist open market economy. So in that sense, it somewhat reflected I think the unity of purpose and the cohesion of ideas and the sense of purpose on the part of the ASEAN of the six. And so we sort of have some sort of what we can call a common ideology that is for the free world, anti-communism, open market economy, as I think the part and parcel of the socio-economic of our respective countries and of the ASEAN community as a whole. So, and in that sense, we could pride ourselves that we were successful from 1967 to 1991. But not only that, beside the internal development and so on, we were able to overcome territorial disputes that were the legacies of the colonial era. And I think peaceful means what's the name of the game. We went to the negotiating table, but not to the borders and have I think, military skirmishes and clashes and so on. The idea of peaceful settlement somehow has become part and parcel of our DNA. So there was a successful story of not only working together, but to overcome disputes through negotiation. That's the first phase of ASEAN, more or less. Then the second phase from my point of view would be from the year 1991 to the year 2007 and 8. That is the period of the post-Cold War or the beginning of the era of globalization and the telecommunication connectivity worldwide, not only within the region of the Asia Pacific. And within this context, I think among ASEAN, there was this belief in multilateralism and regionalism, and I think trade or economic activities cross borders was the key. And within this context also, in the era of globalization, ASEAN was able to expand. So there was the enlargement of ASEAN. From ASEAN of the six, I think Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and eventually Myanmar or Burma joined. So ASEAN became an entity of the 10 ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia region. I think that's a great achievement, this enlargement of ASEAN. What it, I think, reflected or what it signified was that former enemies, on ideological divide, were able to come together, join in an entity called ASEAN. And that is a reflection of the ability to overcome the past animosity and to move forward through reconciliation, friendship, and socio-economic development. And we were able to, I think, work together of the 10 and put the historical animosities in the past, I think, in the refrigerator, put it that way, and move forward. And in that sense, I think also from my personal view, I must, in that sense, put my deep appreciation to the leadership of Vietnam that all along since they joined, I think, ASEAN, I think around 1997 and so on, not a word will ever come forth from the Vietnamese leaderships for the past 20 years and so on of their membership in ASEAN, that they ever raised the issue of the Cold War, especially United States bombers leaving the land of Thailand and bombed many parts of Vietnam. I think somehow the Vietnamese leadership were able to put the past into history book and move forward, and not to allow past, I think, differences, atrocities, and all of this and so on come to the fore and become the obstacle. So this is something that we could also learn from the, I think, the magnanimity of the heart of the Vietnamese leadership, and that did provide, I think, the ASEAN member state to be able to work together and move forward. And I think to the students and to the contestants and so on, this is something that you must be able to appreciate, because most of the time, I think historical events and so on are being, I think, politicized in the current, I think, political life and so on. And I think that is not healthy. We have to move forward. We accept what went wrong in the past, and then we have to move together in the present and into the future in a more positive and reconcilable manner and so on. So I think from 1991 to the year 2007, we more or less, I think, achieved that reconciliation, enlargement, and further integration of the ASEAN members of the 10. And we could also recall the fact that there was this principle or concept of the ASEAN initiative, that is for the more advanced ASEAN member state to help the less advanced ASEAN member state to close the development gap, the income gap, and so on. I think this is a noble undertaking. We have not achieved, I think, the target as yet, but we have to keep on moving forward, so that I think the income disparity between Singapore and Laos or Cambodia will not, I think, be a permanent feature, but it must be somehow overcome and close the gap as much as possible. And then that is still, I think, the homework that all of us would have to continue working together into the future decades and so on. Now, then I move to the third phase of ASEAN. I would start from the year 2007, 2008 to the present. And why did I choose the year 2007 and 8? Because of the fact that we did have the ASEAN Charter. And what we mean by having the ASEAN Charter, what does it mean? It means that from the year 2008, approximately, ASEAN community has become a rule-based organization. The 40 years before that, it was the ASEAN Association, loosely united without any rules. And I think most of the cooperation activities, agreements, and so on were more or less based on a sort of an ad hoc basis. But now with the incoming and the existence of the ASEAN Charter, all the 10 member states have to have the commitments and obligations that are binding. And this is very important. So with that rule-based thing, we all have to act together and move in the same direction. And what are some of the elements of this rule-based community? I think if you go back to read the ASEAN Charter, you will see the words democracy and human rights, and by implication also participation. And on top of the ASEAN Charter, I think combined united policy direction of ASEAN is the first ASEAN must be people-centered. And then the second phase is ASEAN centrality. So ASEAN member states have more or less committed themselves that whatever we are going to do together, the people must be at the core, people must come first. And what it implies, if you link the people-centered phrase to the word human rights and democracy, it means that the people will have to be protected and their human rights and their freedom must be promoted. And at the same time, for them to be really at the core of the whole thing, whatever is going to be done, whatever decision is going to be made, the people must be consulted. So there must be a sort of a consultative and participatory ASEAN community. Then the other word, the ASEAN centrality, what does it mean? It means that whatever is going on or will be going on in the future in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asia-Pacific region, ASEAN must be a sort of in the driver's seat, must be the intellectual, I think, initiator, must have a voice, must have a saying, so that I think the whole Asia-Pacific will be a region of peace, prosperity, and security, and so on. So from the year 2008, we have so many things that we have to pursue. We have told ourselves what we have to do. But it's not only what is going on inside ASEAN community as a whole. At the same time, like from the year 1967 to 1991 and 1991 to 2008, we have to be aware of the international environment and the international context also. Okay. During the Cold War, we did have the backing and the, I think, security umbrella from the Western world, especially the United States, with its 7th Fleet based in Honolulu, Hawaii. The US presence provides some sort of stability to the whole region, and I think allow socio-economic development of every country in the region, especially China, when it started to go away from state-led economy into a sort of state capitalism in combination with the private capitalism and so on. And China has achieved a tremendous socio-economic and surplus in the history of mankind, as we all we know. Then during the 1991 to the year 2007 and 8 and so on, there was this enthusiasm about openness, about less protection, about liberalization, about regionalism, and so on. So we see the rise of APEC, ASEM, and ASEAN in particular has entered into many of the dialogue partnerships with many major countries around the world without discrimination, whether that particular partner is a sort of authoritarian or democratic. It doesn't matter. I think because socio-economic and I think cross-border trade and economic activities were the name of the game. So I think 1991 to the year 2008 was a sort of a period of optimism and of hopes and so on. And so many of, I think, robust economic activities at all levels, you know, the private sector, the government, and so on. And there was also sense of optimism. But after the year 2008, and especially at the beginning of the year 2012, I think the international context as well as the Asia Pacific context started to change a bit with the new political leadership in Beijing, mainland China, because the new leadership of China has declared that it would like to, I think, redress its image, its position in the world, having, I think, been humiliated during in the course of the 19th and early 20th century. So China would like to be number one in the world again, which it used to hold that have held that position before the 16th century, before the European, I think, went out from Europe and went around the world and conquered many parts of the world. And I think did humiliate major countries in Asia Pacific, like India was colonized and Japan was forced to open the country, and China in particular, was forced to accept many of the extraterritorial treaties and agreements with the Western world, and later also with Japan, and was being, I think, invaded, attacked, and occupied by foreign forces and so on. And now the new Chinese leadership, with so much confidence, with so much wealth and power, would like to take back its, I think, position of the past, and it has intended or is intending to get rid of Western influences in the Asia Pacific region, would like to push the United States out of the Asia Pacific region, and would like to change a sort of the international and the regional order to become a sort of the Chinese-led order. And I think what it implies is the Chinese attempt to be a hegemonic power. But at the same time, the United States, I think, did somewhat take up the challenge of the Chinese by declaring that it would not go away. And the latest move by the United States is the declaration by, I think, President Biden, that if Taiwan were to be attacked by China, then the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan as a treaty ally and as a fellow democracy. That's the first point. Second, the United States has also started to intensify bilateral security military relationship with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with India in particular, and to a lesser extent with Singapore and Vietnam, which has, I think, a lot of territorial dispute in the South China Sea with China. And the latest one, as we have heard in the course of the past few months, was the setting up of the quadruple powers, the Quad, the United States, together with Australia, India, and Japan. And I think a few weeks ago, I think mid-September, late September, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia had together announced the setting up of a new security, technological, and industrial military industry alliance and so on in the name of the AUKUS. So what it means is that the United States has declared to the world and sent the message across to China, in particular, that China, the United States will not go away as China would like to wish, but will be entrenched, and at the same time has more or less been able to expand alliances, or I think intensify or increase the contents of the alliance with the countries that I have just mentioned. So I think the rosy picture of globalization, of economic cooperation, of multilateralism, of regionalism, that has been the name of the game since the end of the Cold War in 1991, right up to, I think, the years 2008, or by extension to the year 2011 and so on, is no longer that conducive because of this, I think, the rise of China, its assertiveness, and I think at times a lot of unilateral measures, particularly the militarization of the islets and islands in the South China Sea, in spite of the court ruling of the International Permanent Arbitration Court in favor of the Philippines complaint and so on. But China, as a major superpower and member of the United Nations Security Council, has been rejecting all the court decision altogether. So in that sense, it doesn't bode well for the whole of the Indo-Pacific or for the Asia-Pacific region because of this rivalry between the United States and China. And so far, both sides still intend on, I think, increase the military armaments and so on. And no one side is backing down, but trying to push its position further. And now let me come back to the ASEAN community. So during the Cold War, I think we took side with the Western world and being anti-communist, now led by the Soviet Union and China and so on. And during I think the first 20 years of the era of globalization, everyone was happy because of this expansion of cross-border economic activities and so on. And the socio-economic development was the name of the game. But now, with the rise and the new position, assertive position of China, and I think the United States has accepted the challenge of China, then the question is, then where will ASEAN community? Because it can no longer just stay put and doing nothing and not reacting. I think the question is that, would ASEAN be able to pursue its long-held declaration or the principle of neutrality? Should it go back to look at the ASEAN declaration on Southeast Asia as a zone of peace and neutrality? Or should ASEAN decide to either join the Chinese side or the United States side? So this is a question that I think all of us have to ask ourselves. But to do that, then we also have to ask ourselves, then what animal are we going to be as an ASEAN community, as a regional? I think the problem at the moment is because of unlike the European Union, where membership is based on democratic requirements. A member of the European Union must be a democracy, must have, I think, ensure human rights, must have, I think, a good governance and anti-corruption white paper, put it that way. But I think membership in the ASEAN community has no requirement on what type of political regime or entity a member state should be. But now with the two opposing confrontation and rivalry between two basic ideology. On one side, democracy led by the United States. On the other side, a sort of a totalitarian or authoritarian type of regime led by China. And where is ASEAN at this point in time? In spite of the fact that ASEAN member states are members of so many of the UN conventions on political, social, economic rights, human rights, refugee rights, child's rights, and all of this. And at the same time, I think the spirit of letter of the ASEAN Charter is very much in the direction of openness, of democracy, of people participation, of the protection and promotion of human rights. But I think the reality on the ground within the ASEAN community is the fact that Brunei is an absolute monarchy. Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia are monarchies. But in Cambodia, the position of the monarchy is sort of being caged by the political side and so on. And Thailand has a lot of difficulties so far with military intervention in politics. Malaysia has, I think, the problem of rising Islamism. Then Myanmar is an outright military regime. I think of its 70 years of independence from the British colonialism, 60 years Myanmar has seen the military rule. And currently, the latest coup d'etat on the 1st of February is a cause for concern, not only for the Myanmar people, but for all of us in the ASEAN community, which is a family together. Indonesia seems to, and Philippines seems to be advancing much more in terms of the democratization processes. But the problem is that with this mixed, and the United States is calling out very loudly that it would like to cooperate and work more with fellow democracies. From the security side, I have mentioned about the word Quad and AUKUS. And I think on the 9th of December, President Biden has already started to organize a conference of democracies. So 100 countries will be participating. Only 3 countries from ASEAN are being invited. In Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. Congratulations from my point of view. Thailand and Singapore are not invited because it is semi-democratic. So something for us to remind. So most of us are not members of the democracy club of the world. And second, I think the United States is becoming more and more vocal once again about associating with democracies and make a distinction between democracy and non-democratic regimes. And at the same time, I think the European Union has just come out with the Indo-Pacific strategic guideline or outlook and so on. And some of its member countries like the Netherlands, France, and Germany has also its own national or individual strategic paper on the Indo-Pacific. The United Kingdom, having left the EU, has also its own Indo-Pacific strategic policy direction, and it has sent its aircraft carrier to the Indo-Pacific region and has joined AUKUS with Australia and the United States, meaning that the United Kingdom will be present for the years to come in the area. Not only in terms of economic and development aid and all of this, but in terms of the military hardware, and has, I think, more or less declared itself also to be opposing the authoritarian regime and the, I think, one-party totalitarian model being exported or propagated by the Chinese leadership of today. So I think for the future or for the new ASEAN and so on, I think there must be discussions in every circle of ASEAN, academic world, political bureaucrats, and all of this that is it about time now that we make the membership of ASEAN based on democratic principle or universal values of democracy and human rights? We have to become something. We cannot remain a sort of a very mixed ASEAN entity, half authoritarian, full authoritarian, half democracy and full democracy. I think we cannot go on like this, because with so many of the differences, political ideology, outlook, passion, and so on, we will not be able to handle the global challenges. And by extension, ASEAN centrality will become a joke, a non-entity, insignificant, because whether it's the court arrangement, AUKUS, and so on, we are not part of it because we are not democracies. And we are not invited to Washington on the 9th of December and so on, because most of us are not democracy. But if we want to be the center of everything, we have to be something together of the 10. We cannot be half totalitarian, authoritarian, and democracy. We have to come and talk together that we going to move in the direction of our commitments to the spirit of letters of the various UN Convention on political rights, civil and political rights, or second, to go along the spirit and letters of the ASEAN Charter or not? Or do we, the ASEAN citizens of 650 million, will move to become democratic? Are we going to allow our governments to be authoritarian and suppress us? That's the first question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think because we cannot go on like this. And second is that because that we are so much differences in terms of political ideas and regime and so on, we could not have a cohesive, collective, joint position on the Myanmar crisis of today. We could not have the joint position on the South China Sea vis-a-vis, I think, unilateralism of China. We cannot have the a joint position on the Chinese, I think, activities on the upper Mekong to the detriment of at least two major ASEAN countries, Cambodia and Vietnam. The country is situated at, I think, the end of the Mekong River before it flows into the South China Sea and so on. So all of this, we have to think and ask ourselves that for us to have a common position on anything of importance in the region and internationally, it must start from the basis of a common ideology. But as long as we do not have the common ideology, like we used to have in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that we all were all against communism. So we could have a joint position, a joint movement. We were able to work together to have the international community to pressure the Vietnamese to leave Cambodia in the 1980s. And then we were able to have the United Nations to do the interim administration of Cambodia and turn Cambodia, away from civil war and occupation by foreigners and all of this into a democratic country with a constitution and so on. But whether it was being abused later is another question. It's for the Cambodian people, I think, to keep on working to really, I think, formalize the democratization process of Cambodia. And if we become more democratic in all of the ASEAN, then we can help our Cambodian friends, we can help our Laotian friend and our Vietnamese friend to get the freedom that they had been trying to get from France, from the French colonialism. They did succeed. But when the French left, I think they have been confronted with the authoritarianism of the Communist Party, either of Vietnam and Laos. So why should you subjugate your own people when you were trying very hard at one time to get rid of foreigners, whether it's the British, the Dutch, or the French? But there is no right for any of our leaders to suppress our own people. And I think this is something that we have to have, that because we talk about ASEAN as a people-centered entity, and we cannot have the people-centered entity as long as our own people, all of us, including myself as a Thai, is still living under a sort of a semi-military authoritarian regime, and we do have a constitution that is not democratic at all. And that is one of the reasons why Thailand in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the 1990s, was, I think, the delight of the Western world, of the free world, and so on, because our democracy was blossoming. But later in this 21st century, we have 2 coups d'etats. And now we are in a situation where President Biden didn't look at the name Thailand, and Thailand was not invited to the summit conference on democracy. I think it's a shame for the country. And I think the culprits are the military juntas and the military political authoritarian things that I think only use the excuses of elections in order to control country in an authoritarian manner. So this is something that we all have to work together for the whole of ASEAN, that from my point of view, we have to transform ASEAN to become fully democratic at the ASEAN community level, and as well as at each national level. That's one point. Second point is that putting the political issue aside, there are still many outstanding socio-economic issues that we have to overcome quickly. One of the main issues is this question of connectivity. We should not have, I think, robust immigration and custom procedure between Singapore and Malaysia, Malaysia and Thailand, Thailand and Myanmar, Thailand and Laos, and Thailand and Cambodia, Cambodia and Vietnam, and Laos, Laos and Vietnam, and so on. We should have been moving much faster on, I think, the cross-border facilitation to make it as easier, less customized, less immigrationized as possible for the free flow. And we should have to facilitate these cross-border activities. And we should not be using passport in traveling in the 10 countries. I think we should have ASEAN card or something like this. And then there should be more liberalization of the, I think, free flow of the professionals and skilled laborers and so on. This is something that we have to do. We should facilitate ourselves, I think, in academic exchanges, mutual recognition as much as possible, and to work together to help upgrade each other as well as on the research and development. So that's, I think, more or less on the connectivity. Second, I think we have to rewrite history, because most of our histories of the region as well of our individual countries were being written by the French, British, the Dutch, the Americans. But it's about time that we get together, our historian, archaeologists, and so on, and rewrite Southeast Asia history together. And at the same time, we must review the history textbook, about Thai-Vietnam relations, Thai-Cambodia, Laos, and so on, because most of the current textbooks has that antagonistic, unforgiven historical episodes and so on. I think we should look at the reconciliation between the French and the Germans and the Polish and so on. That once they have come to terms with history and accept what happened in the textbook for children, then they could have moved forward. And they did that. And I think we still have to do that. I think to clear up and clean up the history textbook, to accept the fact of what happened, apologize, yes, but move forward, but not to use history to become the political issues and to provide more hatred and discontentment and distrust among our children and the citizens at large. The other issue that I think ASEAN has to work together on the socio-economic thing is to have a master plan on migrant workers. Obligation of the sending country, transit country, and the receiving country. We should have similar rules. And I think Singapore has one of the best migration rules for migrant workers. We could use the Singapore, and we could work together with the International Labour Organization to have a more of a standardized migrant worker master plan, in terms of screening, accepting, looking after the well-being, including their family members and so on, as a community of humanity and not of exploitation and unequal treatment between the national workers and the foreign workers and so on. So master plan, we should have also master plan on refugees. I think Malaysia and Thailand in particular are being, I think, confronted with the Rohingyas, what to do. Occasionally, Thailand gets, I think, political exiles, both from Myanmar, from Cambodia, and Laos, and so on. How do we work together? Because Malaysia also do get some, so that there will not be sent back, because political exiles should not be sent back to the original country, because they are opposing the government that are not very nice to the people and so on. So we must have a standard and sets of rules that reflect, I think, the moral righteousness of our respective countries and societies and so on. So refugee, migrant workers. The other point that I think we should work while we are transforming ASEAN to become democracy is on the harmonization of the internal tax laws. Because with the differences in the internal tax and so on, that could lead to, I think, smuggling. For example, I think the differences in terms of price and taxation on palm oil between Malaysia and Thailand. And in that sense, it leads to a lot of smuggling of the Malaysian palm oil to Thailand, as well as oil, benzene and so on for cars from Malaysia to Thailand, because of the differences in prices and taxation and so on. But as a community, we should have the harmonization of a lot of laws and so on, internal law, to make, I think, free flow and overcoming corruption and smuggling businesses and so on. Otherwise, we cannot become a real community if we have so many different sets of rules, regulations, and law and taxation law and so on. So these are some of the points that I think the ASEAN leadership must work. One is, I think, in short, enhancement of the ASEAN internal market to make it one market as much as possible. And at the same time, I think to work on the different political regimes to make it more democratic in order to, I think, answer the notion of people-centered ASEAN, as well as to raise the, I think, the identity, respectability, credibility of ASEAN in the eyes of the international community, that we are a community of openness, of humanity, that we no longer, I think, a community of fear, repression, and suppression by the authorities. So I would like to leave this to you. I will be more than happy to entertain some questions. Thank you very much. Swadikap.
Thank you very much for an inspiring lecture. Now, let us move on with Q&A session. So those who have questions, please do not hesitate to contact our staff. Okay, I'm going to start with the first question. How can ASEAN's views on centrality, human rights, and people-centered rights be reconciled with growing Chinese hegemony? Once again, how can ASEAN's views on centrality, human rights, and people-centered rights be reconciled with growing Chinese hegemony? Mr. Kasit, please.
Yes, I think we all of us, 650 million people, most of us had been under colonization. And we have emancipated ourselves, we became independent from the European rules, and I think to a certain Americans in the Philippines and so on. So if we became liberated from the Western world, why should we also get ourselves to become a sort of a semi-vassal state to China? And second, we have regained our freedom and our liberty. Why should we go along the way of a totalitarian socio-political model of China? So the efforts of our, I think, freedom fighters, General Aung San of Myanmar and so on, to Sukarno, Hatta of Indonesia, and many of the leaders of the Philippines all had fought for freedom. And I think subsequent generations of leaders have turned around and suppressed their own people. Then how can we have that people-centered? So I think it has to the change just must occur inside each of the ASEAN country. And once we become more liberated, more open, more people-centered, more democratic, then we have nothing to fear about the Chinese inroads, influence, and hegemonic tendency. So we all have to work. We have to keep on telling our political parties, our political leaders, that you have to honor the principle of people-centered. That is, the people are the master. The people are not the slaves of the political leadership and so on. They have to serve us. We don't have to take instructions from them. I think this is what we do. So it's more of the internal thing that we have to keep on pursuing the democratization process to make the principle or the concept of people-centered a reality and not a rhetoric. That you give speeches or you come out with joint statement and it looks good and so on. But in reality, there is nothing that is called people-centered so far. And then I think for the ASEAN community is still very much of a bureaucracy-led entity, because the bureaucracy and the political leadership do not talk to the ASEAN people about the decision on certain things and so on. There is no venue for consultation. And I think one thing that could have been to be changed is inside the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly based in Jakarta. If that assembly, which represent political parties of the ASEAN country, could become more democratic, inviting NGOs, academic world, think tanks, and so on, the private sector, farmer association, labor association, labor union of ASEAN, and so on, to have a voice. Then they can go and talk at the ASEAN assembly and so on. That would be one thing. And second is that during the ASEAN ministerial meeting or the leaders meeting at the summit and so on, many, I think, professional association or even the academic world, and then ASEAN university could get together and be invited to submit proposals and to be helping the government to work on this democratization process, on the realization of the people-centered ASEAN. So many things could have been done, but what it needs now is, I think, a push from us ordinary people, and second, from the political vision of the leaders and so on, and also for the bureaucrats, that they should serve the people, not only their political masters.
For the clear answer for the first question, I would like to continue with the related question. Using the EU or US as models of democratic organizations show the weakness of these models. Both the EU and US are in the process, are being torn apart by internal differences. Isn't a Chinese model stronger? One more time, please. Using the EU or US as models of democratic organization show the weakness of these models. Both EU and US are in the process, being torn apart by internal differences. Isn't a Chinese model stronger, sir?
I am aware for certainty, for sure, that there are differences within the Communist Party of China. And once you have the differences, the only cause, once you are caught, either you are hanged or you are imprisoned throughout your life. So whichever system, there are differences, but how do you handle the differences is a different matter. In the Chinese model, either you are killed or you are imprisoned. And there is no certainty at the moment that President Xi will last forever. He looks very strong. But I think I have known that there are undercurrents, because there are Chinese on the mainland China that would like to be free. And I think a case in point is the Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai. She was, I think, abused by a senior government official. And then she raised her voice. And then I think she disappeared for a couple of weeks until international pressure forthcoming. Then the Chinese allow her to come out from wherever it is and then communicate with the world. But that's how you get rid of the differences. But in the Western system, the differences can be aired in the open, and you are not abducted, or you are not being forced to silence. And then at the end of the day, I think the Court of Justice, the Supreme Court of the United States, or the Supreme Court of any of the members of the European Union, or I think the Court of Justice of the European Union, I think has one of the highest integrity, and it's fair. So that's it. So whatever it is and so on, the differences in the Western or in the Western democracy can be aired in the open. And I think the final outcome is at the Court of Justice, but not at the prison somewhere, or being ostracized forever, living alone in one's own house or apartment, but cannot communicate with anyone and so on. And there is no chances, to be able to live as a free person again. And we have seen, even in some of our countries, the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, in Thailand, because that is again, I think, authoritarian practice or the use of the majority absolutism in the parliament to carry out suppression against its own people and so on. And I would still prefer that whatever the problem that there could be in a society, let's have it out in the open. I'm also a bit concerned at the situation in Thailand because young people come out on the street to demand certain things that are not conducive to the ears and eyes of the establishment. And the only thing that they got is not answers or explanation, but police forces and court cases for, I think, disturbing the peace of the country called Thailand and so on. I think this is a choice, but I would still prefer that we will be able to protest, that our voice will be heard, and there is a venue for our voice to be heard, and there will be discussion in the open, but not by the secretive party decision as the Chinese model.
Thank you very much, sir, for clear visions we got from the way that you answered the question. Before we move on to the next question, I have the announcement from the organizer. May we request all judges stay in this room and for the competition. And if you go somewhere, please come back at 10:55 because we are going to start the competition at 11 o'clock sharp. Okay, start the competition at 11 o'clock sharp. May we request all judges stay in this room for the competition, or if you go somewhere, please come back at 10:55 because we are going to start at 11. And the next question, sir, I have right here. In your opinion, are the risks of opening the country to foreign visitors while the COVID-19 situation is still unresolved, with the potential benefits of increased foreign capital inflow? One more time, sir. In your opinion, are the risks of opening the country to foreign visitors while the COVID-19 situation is still unresolved, with the potential benefits of increased foreign capital inflow? His Excellency, please.
I would prefer to complete the processes of vaccination, at least 70% of the whole population of each country. And so I don't agree with my government for opening up the country to tourism, in spite of the fact that the first vaccines and the second vaccines have not reached 70% of the 67 million population of Thailand. That's the first point. Second, why should all political leaders only think of seeking income from tourism when there are so many economic sectors that could, I think, shore up the economic decline because of the COVID-19 at this point in time? I have given interviews, participate in panels, and write articles and so on. I would have preferred the Thai government to use the existing budget and the money that they have been borrowing in the tunes of billions of dollars and so on to put into the, I think, infrastructure development and employ as much labor as possible. So government, and then at the same time, it could put money on research and development into the green and circular economy and so on. So there are so many economic activities that we could have done or should do, not only just to rely everything on the inflow of Chinese tourists and the Indian and the Middle East tourists coming to Thailand. I think that is the easy way out, but a bit risky because the COVID situation is still not, I think, placid in that sense. So the government should, I think, not put attention or the eggs in one basket of tourism and then not doing other economic activities in the country. The government can be a big investor in the country because it has the budget and it has the ability to borrow more money than the private sector. And I think because of the global, the climate change, COVID-19, and the fact that Thailand is in a middle income trap like Malaysia and so on, we cannot keep on relying on a sort of a sunset industries, and we cannot go on become an assembly nation and so on. You know, we have to use the brain of our own, and I think Singapore is taking the lead in the biotechnology, in I think energy conservation, and in alternative and renewable energy and so on. So we can always look at the example of Singapore at the moment, what it is doing. And I think other ASEAN governments can do similarly also. We have the commitment to the Paris Agreement, to the UN SDG, and then lately, I think, to the COP26 in Glasgow and so on. Our leaders have participated in all of this. And in that sense, you cannot go on, I think, running the country on the tourism promotion. You know, that's one. Second, you have to make a distinction between tourist inflow and foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment would not come to Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia unless and until we move into the, I think, what you call this BEG, green circular economy and so on. Thailand has been developing itself the past 50 years as the, I think, assembly plant for Japanese and Korean and European cars. I think all of this will be moving out, or has already started to move out into neighboring countries, particularly Vietnam. We cannot go on with electronic parts and so on. We have to go up the ladder. And Singapore is, I think, leading this. So why not Thailand or Malaysia follow suit? So we have, but foreign direct investment would come in only when we have a new economic development plan based on SDG, and I think on the green economy, circular blue economy, or whatever it is, you know, and intensive agricultural practice, agro-industry that would not be using fertilizers and chemicals and so on, but would be more ecologically oriented. This is something that we have to do. So I think what is needed now is for our ASEAN government to have a new social and especially economic development plan based in the planet Earth sustainability. You know, we have to do away with benzene and what you call diesel using car. But I have not heard the announcement from the Thai government as yet about phasing out, I think, fossil fuel cars. Second, electricity in Thailand is mostly being produced from coal, and we have to import 80% of coal from abroad. The government still has not announced the, I think, phasing out of coal in the next 10 years. And then we have to go into the alternative and renewable energy. And I think all of us in the ASEAN, we have plenty of sun, at least 10 hours a day. We have waves, we have wind, we have mountains, we have waste that could be turned into fuel and so on. But there is no collective plan or master plan among ASEAN countries as yet, and no national individual plan. Only Singapore has some sort of a plan in that direction. But Singapore is a city-state, you know, it's easier to decide and to run things. But I think most of us are agricultural and more urbanization and so on. And then we need more infrastructure movements and all of this. Then we have to have I think various master plan for new economies. And then we cannot keep on depending on I think the know-how from China and Western world and so on. We have to do more research and activities. And I think ASEAN universities should, I think, work together more on the, I think, the scientific side beside the humanitarian side and so on, on the social side, but more on the scientific things like this. Indonesia has the, I think, aircraft industry in Bandung. Can we work together, you know, to help improve, do the spare parts exchanges and things like this? Could we do the electric battery, I think, research and development together to, I think, cater to, I think, to provide to our car industries? We could do a lot on, I think, the sea waves energy and the solar energy and so on. And we could do, I think, a more, I think green-oriented agricultural practices, using less chemicals input and all of this and so on. But so far, there have not been any news about our economic leaders, our economic research institutes, the private sector, and so on, having a real discussions on this. Everyone has been talking about opening up the country for the tourist flow. The Chinese, they are not allowing people to come in. So why do you open the country when all of us are more or less dependent on 30-40% of Chinese tourists? So it's unrealistic to open a country when I think the tourists are not coming anywhere. The whole of Europe now is embedded with COVID-19 and so on. So it's unrealistic. But it's good for political rhetorics and so on. I'm opening up the country and so on. And then on top of that, Thailand still use the emergency law. How can you continue with emergency law and then you open the country for the tourist flow? Then the government being accused that you use the emergency flow in order to curtail the freedom of expression. So the government get negative, outcome for whatever it is and so on, because it reflects that there has not been enough of the deep thought and extensive discussion among all the stakeholders and so on, and cause the direction of the country, and by extension also to get more cooperation with Malaysia and Singapore in particular and so on. So a lot of thinking has to be done, and I think the role of the academic world as a contributor to the ideas and so on is very, very important. I think the academic freedom is very important. And I would like to urge all the professors, lecturers, please do look at this, and then you can, I think, provide recommendations to the government at large, because most of the politicians, they live on an hour day-to-day basis about that, I think, popularity and the votes and so on. They have no time to look at I think, even the medium-term perspective of the country.
Thank you very much, sir, for, I would say, invaluable vision, suggestion, and initiation. May I request a short answer to this? I think have to be last question. What advice would you give to Thai youth wishing enter the global workforce, or maybe ASEAN youth, okay, and build a secure economy in post-pandemic ASEAN? Again, what advice would you give to ASEAN youth wishing enter the global workforce and build a secure economy in post-pandemic ASEAN? His Excellency, please.
First is the English language proficiency. Second is the computer literacy. Third is to know about the global issues, requirements, norms, and practices. Because whatever you're going to do in the future, you have to know the global requirements and rules that pertain to sustainability, corporate social responsibility, all this. You have to know all of this in order to be able to work in a conducive environment, and whatever you produce, it has to go by the international requirements. You cannot just simply produce anything without being knowledgeable about SDGs and sustainability requirements. And if you have the computer ability and so on, now you can sell your ideas on your phone. So you are fully connected to the world. So if you are creative and if you are computer savvy and so on, there are chances that you can be integrated into the international economy, or you can even promote or sell yourself on the market that you are good. So the chances of getting more work will be there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for keynote lecture, and then also, I would say, the answer of the question that give vision and then also give us a creative idea and then lead us to the practices that we would do for our country and then also our responsibilities. Also, thank you very much, sir. ขอบคุณมากครับ